This week in our Wonderful Day in the Lord broadcast, we have been working through the death of Jesus Christ, the fact that he physically died, spiritually was separated from the Father for a period of time, whatever that might mean. We've seen who put him on the cross, and we've seen at least one of the reasons he went to the cross was to redeem us from the curse of the law, so that we could be given the righteousness of Christ on the basis of faith. We're going to move on today to another significance, and the fact that he died in our place because of our sin. Romans chapter 5 is where I want to go. This is one of my favorite passages on this subject because it lays it out so clearly, our need, just how desperately we needed Jesus to do something for us because we could not do it for ourselves. So Romans chapter 5 and verse 6 says this, "For while we were still helpless, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly." So we find, first of all, that we, before salvation, were helpless, and at that point in time, in our helpless condition, incapable of doing anything to make ourselves right before God, Christ died for us. He also calls us here the ungodly, which we might think of that as horribly sinful, but it's simply ones who are not in line with God. We're not living God's way. We're not going God's way. He died for not perfect people or wonderful people, but for ungodly people like us. And then he moves on down to verse 8. He says, "For God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." So once again, Christ died for us. And that word "for" is on behalf of, in our place. And that's the significance that we're looking at today. Christ took our place on the cross. He took our sin upon himself on the cross. He took our judgment and our curse upon himself on the cross. And he did so while we were yet sinners, is what our passage says. Not while we were righteous, because we weren't, or not because we were wonderful people again, but because the very fact that we were sinners and had fallen short of the standard of God, he died for us. And then in verse 10, he says, "For if while we were enemies," another powerful word, "we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more having been reconciled, we'll be saved by his life." So we're now enemies of God. And most people would not identify themselves in that way, but God does. God calls us his enemies. So here's these four words. I've always underlined them or circled them in my Bibles, where we were helpless, ungodly, sinners, and the enemies of God. Under that condition, our condition is in that way, he died for you and I. What a beautiful picture he gives us. But we also want to see this fleshed out more clearly in passages like 2 Corinthians 5:21 that gives us in one verse, the full picture, I think, of what Christ has done. It says in 5:21, "He made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf so that we might become the righteousness of God in him." Why did Christ go to the cross? Well, because he who knew no sin, that's Christ, died on our behalf or in our place. Why? So that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. In other words, he not only took our sin upon himself, which he did, he also gave us his righteousness, so that we are now in the sight of God righteous or holy before him. We're not holy in our actions. We still sin. We're not perfected yet. That will take place in eternity. But we have been given the righteous standard of God. We are made righteous in the eyes of God because of Christ. There's another wonderful verse that says much the same thing, all the way back in 1 Peter 3:18. It says this, "For Christ also died for sin once for all, that the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit." Listen to this verse again. Christ died for sins once for all. Once again, on our behalf, because of sin, because there was nothing in our helpless, sinful, ungodly state that we could do to remedy the problem of sin, he died for us. And he did it once. He doesn't do it perpetually. He doesn't do it more than once. He did it once for all. The just for the unjust. This is not fair. He He who knew no sin died for people who were filled with sin. Why? So that he could bring us to God, so that we could be brought to the Lord himself. Having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. The Lord did not stay in the grave. He resurrected from the grave, which will be our theme next week. But here we're looking at the death of Christ. He died in the flesh, physically, so that we could be made right before God. What wonderful scriptures were given here to tell us why Christ died for us. He died in our place that we could be given not only the removal of our sin, but the very righteousness of himself. This should give us a wonderful day in the Lord.